There are very few culinary experiences on Earth as quietly revered as traditional Japanese omakase. The word itself translates directly from Japanese as, "I leave it up to you." You surrender control entirely to the chef. You sit down at a minimalist wooden counter somewhere in New York, London, or Tokyo. You are paying upwards of $150, sometimes $250 or more, for a multi-course tasting menu curated entirely by a master. You trust the chef. You trust the restaurant. You trust that because you are paying a premium price, every ingredient on your plate arrived through a pristine, ethical, and completely legal supply chain. By the end of this video, you will know exactly why that trust is misplaced, and you will never look at a high-end sushi menu the same way again. The sushi industry in the United States alone was valued at approximately $2 billion, according to a 2022 report by Ibis World, reflecting a 3.7% annual growth rate between 2017 and 2022. A 2023 survey by the National Restaurant Association found that 24% of consumers had dined at a sushi restaurant in the previous year. The global sushi market reached an estimated value of $18.25 billion in 2021, with projections placing it at $29.44 billion by 2027, growing at an annual rate of 7.2%. This is not a niche hobby. This is a planet-scale food industry, and somewhere buried deep inside, it is one of the most organized and profitable wildlife crime networks on Earth. When you order unagi, the Japanese term for freshwater eel grilled over charcoal and glazed with a rich, dark soy-based sauce, that single bite of food is the final transaction in what investigators have described as a multi-billion-dollar global criminal operation. That piece of meat moving slowly from your chopsticks to your lips has almost certainly passed through the hands of heavily armed poachers, international smuggling networks moving live animals packed in oxygenated water, corrupt customs officials, and industrial-scale aquaculture operations designed specifically to make illegal fish look legal on paper. This video will show you the full chain, step by step, from the freezing rivers of Europe all the way to the lacquered wooden counter in front of you. To fully understand what is happening, you need to know one thing about the European eel, known scientifically as Anguilla anguilla. This species is listed as critically endangered on the International Union for Conservation of Nature Red List. That designation means it sits one category away from extinction in the wild. Since the 1980s, the European eel population has collapsed by over 90%. 90%. That is not a gradual decline. That is a biological freefall. Researchers, conservationists, and government agencies across the European Union have spent decades trying to reverse this collapse, and the population continues to fall. The primary driver of that collapse is demand. Specifically, demand from the high-end sushi and unagi markets across North America, Europe, and Asia. Here is the first layer of the crime that almost nobody talks about. The European eel cannot be bred in captivity. That single biological fact is the engine that powers this entire criminal network. Scientists have been attempting to crack the eel's reproductive code for decades, with almost no success. The reason is extraordinary. The European eel is born in a place called the Sargasso Sea, a strange body of water in the middle of the North Atlantic that sits inside the Bermuda Triangle region, bounded not by coastlines, but entirely by ocean currents. Eels migrate thousands of miles from European rivers out into the open Atlantic and disappear into the deep, dark water of the Sargasso to spawn. No scientist has ever observed a European eel reproducing in the wild. No laboratory in the world has successfully produced a self-sustaining captive breeding population. Every single European eel in existence today was born in the wild, in the open ocean, and swam its way to shore as a tiny transparent larva called a glass eel. That biological impossibility means one thing for the market. The only way to supply European eel to farms and restaurants is to take it directly from nature. There is no factory farm workaround. There is no sustainable aquaculture solution. You cannot grow your own. You have to steal them from the wild. And that is exactly what organized criminal networks have been doing on an industrial scale. Every spring, As water temperatures rise across Western Europe, microscopic glass eels appear along the Atlantic coastlines of France, Spain, the United Kingdom, and Portugal. These translucent baby eels, barely the length of a matchstick, are worth more by weight than cocaine on the black market. A single kilogram of live glass eels can sell for hundreds of euros in some markets. Criminal syndicates, some with direct ties to organized crime networks in Asia, deploy entire armed crews to intercept these migrations before conservation authorities can count them, let alone protect them. The poaching operations along French rivers and estuaries have at times resembled paramilitary logistics. Teams and waders move through freezing water at night, using fine mesh nets to scoop enormous quantities of glass eels from the water. They pack them alive into oxygenated containers, bags filled with water, and pressurized pure oxygen to keep the eels breathing through hours of transport. Those containers then make their way to airports, tucked inside luggage, hidden in cargo shipments, or strapped to the bodies of human couriers moving through international departure halls. Interpol has conducted multiple operations targeting these smuggling networks, with investigators describing airport seizures of glass eels hidden in everything from suitcases to personal luggage disguised as ordinary travel items. The destination in almost every case is the aquaculture belt of mainland China, particularly the Fujian province, which hosts some of the largest eel farming operations in the world. These farms are entirely legal. They hold the correct permits and international certifications to raise and harvest eel species local to Asia. On paper, their supply chains are spotless. Their export documentation is verified. Their customs paperwork is in order. To a buyer in New York or London examining an invoice, everything looks perfectly legitimate. But here is where the laundering happens, and it is almost elegant in how simple it is. To the naked human eye, the critically endangered European eel and the legal Asian eel species are virtually impossible to tell apart. The body shape, the coloration, the size at maturity, they are nearly identical visually. When black market brokers receive shipments of smuggled European glass eels, they sell those live animals directly to the legal farms. The farm operators mix the illegal European eels into the same concrete tanks as their legal Asian stock. The two populations grow together. They eat together. They are harvested together. And when a customs inspector or health official arrives to check the harvest, they are looking at a tank full of adult eels where no visual examination can separate one species from another. The only method capable of identifying the species with certainty is laboratory-grade DNA testing. And running that kind of test on millions of individual fish moving through an industrial supply chain is not practical. It is expensive, time-consuming, and requires equipment most customs facilities do not have on-site. The syndicates understand this limitation better than the regulators do. It is not an accidental vulnerability. It is a calculated one. Once the eels reach harvest size, which typically takes somewhere between 12 and 18 months from glass eel stage, the processing begins. The eels are slaughtered, expertly filleted, grilled over charcoal on industrial-scale conveyor systems, glazed in sweet soy-based sauce in a style called kabayaki, and then vacuum-sealed in thick plastic packaging. At this point, the documentation accompanying the shipment describes the entire batch as legally raised Asian eel, product of China, certified for export. The illegal European fish now wears a completely legal identity. It gets loaded into freezer containers and shipped worldwide. When the executive chef at a high-end sushi restaurant in Manhattan or Paris receives that shipment, the invoices are clean, the customs stamps are official, and the packaging shows all the right certifications. From the chef's perspective, every visible indicator points to a legal, certified product. Many chefs genuinely have no idea what they are actually receiving. The laundering process is sophisticated enough that the restaurant often functions as an unwitting final destination in a fraud chain that begins thousands of miles away. But there is a more uncomfortable truth sitting inside some of the upper levels of the culinary world. European eels develop a distinctly richer fat content than their Asian counterparts. The cold, fast-moving rivers of Western Europe push the eel's body to develop a thicker, more heavily marbled layer of fat as an energy reserve for its extraordinary oceanic migration. In professional kitchens, fat is flavor. That extra marbling creates a deeper, richer caramelization when the meat hits the charcoal grill. It produces a different texture on the palate, a different intensity of flavor. An experienced sushi chef who works with unagi regularly can often detect these differences through touch, through the way the fat renders, through the specific way the glaze behaves on the surface of the meat. Some chefs, confronted with a product that performs noticeably better on the grill than standard certified Asian eel, but arrives with clean paperwork, make a specific choice. They do not ask more questions. The demand from wealthy diners for that particular flavor profile is high and consistent. Questioning the supply chain too aggressively risks losing access to the best product. So the paperwork says it is legal. The meat looks and cooks beautifully, and the chef moves forward without pressing further. This is what investigators and food journalists have described as a kind of quiet, deliberate look the other way culture inside certain segments of the high-end seafood industry. Independent marine biologists and investigative food journalists began testing this theory by going directly to restaurants. The method was straightforward. Order unagi as a normal customer, take the meat home, and submit it for DNA analysis at a certified laboratory. The results, gathered across repeated studies targeting restaurants in North America and Europe, were alarming. Studies have found that in certain markets, over 50%, and in some cases up to 70%, of the unagi being served in restaurants tested positive as the critically endangered, illegally sourced European species. Not a fringe finding from one or two locations. A pattern repeated across major cities, including New York and Los Angeles, and across major European capitals. Think about what those numbers mean against the backdrop of the industry's scale. The United States sushi restaurant industry alone was generating around $2 billion annually as of 2022. If a large percentage of the unagi being sold inside that industry is illegally sourced European eel, the financial footprint of the criminal networks embedded within this legal food economy is enormous. The omakase dining category sits at the top of this industry. Restaurants like Masa in New York City, where omakase starts at around $650 per person, or Sushi Nakazawa, led by chef Daisuke Nakazawa, and recognized as one of the most acclaimed omakase destinations in the city, operate at a level of perceived quality and craft that commands absolute customer trust. According to research published by Eater in 2023, the average cost of omakase per person in major United States cities like New York and Los Angeles ranges between $100 and $250. These are not casual dining environments. Customers paying those prices are explicitly buying the belief that they are consuming something rare, legal, ethically sourced, and expertly curated. Chef Daisuke Nakazawa himself has described omakase as a trust relationship. His exact words, "Omakase is a trust thing. You have to trust your chef." That statement hits differently when you understand how deeply compromised the supply chain for one of the most popular omakase proteins actually is. The omakase trend accelerated dramatically in the United States through the 2000s and into the 2010s. The New York Times published a widely read feature on the omakase trend in 2011, which is widely credited with pushing the format further into mainstream fine dining culture in American cities. By 2023, the National Restaurant Association data showing that nearly 1 in 4 American consumers had visited a sushi restaurant in the previous year reflects just how normalized this cuisine has become. It began in the United States back in the 1960s, when Japanese immigrants introduced sushi in Los Angeles, sparking a cultural shift that took decades to mature into the high-end omakase format we see today. The COVID-19 pandemic in 2020 temporarily disrupted the restaurant industry's physical dining model, but many high-end omakase operations adapted by offering luxury takeout experiences, maintaining their pricing and their customer relationships even through closures. The demand never fully collapsed. The infrastructure on the supply side kept running. The 2022 period also saw a growing public conversation about sustainability in seafood. Publications like Eater, nonprofits like Monterey Bay Seafood Watch, and a wave of investigative food journalism brought greater attention to sourcing practices inside the sushi industry. But awareness and action are different things. Knowing that bluefin tuna is under pressure from overfishing is one thing. Knowing that the specific piece of grilled eel on your omakase plate tonight may have been physically smuggled out of a French river in an oxygenated bag by an armed criminal crew is a very different level of exposure. The sustainability discussion in sushi dining has tended to focus on popular high-profile species like bluefin tuna, where organizations like Monterey Bay Seafood Watch have produced detailed consumer guides. Unagi has received comparatively less attention in mainstream sustainability conversations, despite the European eel's critically endangered status and the extraordinary scale of organized poaching targeting its glass eel life stage. The species' story is quieter, less visible, and for the criminal networks that profit from it, that lower public profile has been an advantage. Forcia Foods, a company based in Israel, represents one of the most direct technological responses to this crisis. The company is working on cellular agriculture, a process where a small number of cells are taken from an eel and used to grow structured, edible eel tissue in a laboratory setting without ever raising or killing a whole fish. Advanced bioprinting technology is being used in this work to create tissue with the correct layering and texture that would allow it to function as a substitute for traditional unagi in professional kitchens. The appeal of this approach is obvious. If you can grow the product without touching wild eel populations, you eliminate the poaching incentive entirely. But the Michelin-star ecosystem is not easily moved by technical alternatives. The culture of high-end Japanese dining places enormous weight on the concept of authentic, natural, wild-sourced ingredients. Chefs in this space build reputations on the specific provenance and quality of what they serve. The idea of presenting lab-grown eel on an omakase menu at $150 or more per person runs directly against the narrative those restaurants sell. Even if the lab-grown version is culinarily indistinguishable from the wild product, the market psychology is a real obstacle. Premium food experiences are partly about the story of the ingredient. Customers paying for a handcrafted omakase experience at Nobu, the globally recognized brand co-founded by celebrity chef Nobu Matsuhisa, are purchasing an idea alongside a meal. As Matsuhisa himself has said, food is not just about eating. It is about creating an experience. That attachment to experience, to the story of wild fish pulled from cold water and handled by a master's hands, is exactly what the criminal networks exploit. The black market eel entering this supply chain does not just satisfy culinary demand. It satisfies a cultural mythology around rarity, wildness, and luxury. And mythology is hard to legislate again. The international legal framework governing trade in endangered species is built around the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species of Wild Fauna and Flora, commonly referred to as CITES. The European eel is listed under CITES Appendix 2, meaning that commercial international trade in the species requires specific permits and monitoring. The syndicates dealing in glass eels have developed sophisticated methods for corrupting or bypassing this framework, including bribing officials responsible for issuing export certificates and exploiting administrative loopholes that exist when fish cross multiple jurisdictions before reaching their final market. The fish might move from France to a processing point in another country before continuing to Asia, each border crossing adding distance and complexity that makes tracing the chain backward progressively more difficult. Interpol and Europol have both conducted operations targeting the glass eel smuggling network in recent years, with seizures at major European airports identifying significant quantities of live glass eels concealed in personal luggage and cargo. These operations represent genuine enforcement effort, but the scale of the poaching networks means that seizures represent a fraction of total smuggling volume. The profit margins are high enough that criminal organizations absorb enforcement losses and continue operating. The European eel population data makes the consequences of continued poaching stark. A 90% decline since the 1980s is a collapse without historical precedent among commercially exploited European fish species. The European Union has implemented fishing restrictions and glass eel quotas in an attempt to allow some level of managed harvest while protecting the breeding population. Conservation programs have worked to transport adult eels around hydroelectric dams that block migration routes. But these measures are operating against the backdrop of an industrial-scale criminal extraction that removes millions of glass eels from European waterways before they ever have the chance to grow. The Omakase diner, sitting at a polished wooden counter, somewhere between the elegant first and final courses of a 2 to 3 hour multi-course tasting experience, has almost no way of knowing what is on the plate. The vacuum-sealed packaging in the kitchen looks correct. The chef's credentials are real. The restaurant's reputation is earned. Every visible signal says this is a legitimate, high-quality dining environment. But the gap between what is visible and what is real in this supply chain is the entire space where a multi-billion-dollar criminal operation lives. The 2023 push towards sustainable sourcing practices inside the sushi restaurant industry is a genuine shift in attitude among a portion of the industry's operators. Some omakase chefs have removed unagi from their menus entirely, unwilling to navigate a supply chain they cannot fully verify. Others have moved towards substituting domestic eel species not listed as critically endangered, or toward presenting diners with explicit sourcing disclosures. These are meaningful steps, but they remain exceptions rather than the operating standard. What would actually move the needle is laboratory-grade DNA testing, becoming a routine part of the customs and import process for processed eel products. The technology exists. The biological markers that distinguish European eel from Asian eel are identifiable through DNA analysis. The barrier is cost and logistics, and the fact that no major regulatory body has yet made such testing mandatory for processed eel imports at scale. Until that changes, the visual impossibility of distinguishing the two species at the processing and packaging stage remains the single most useful tool in the criminal supply chain. You paid for a meal built on trust. Trust in the chef, trust in the sourcing, trust in the institution of fine dining itself. Daisuke Nakazawa's description of omakase as a trust relationship captures something real about the emotional transaction at the heart of this dining format. The customer genuinely wants to believe in the chef's integrity, and in many cases, that integrity is real. But integrity inside the restaurant does not fix a corrupted supply chain that is broken several thousand miles upstream in a dark river at midnight, or in the cargo hold of an international flight. The species being eaten into extinction is not the bluefin tuna, which has at least attracted widespread public attention and advocacy. It is a small, transparent animal that most people could not identify in a photograph. Born in the deep ocean in a place science still cannot fully map. Smuggled alive in oxygen bags through international airports, washed clean through industrial farms, processed into vacuum-sealed packages that look identical to legal products, and placed in front of you by a chef who may genuinely believe he has done everything right. When you order unagi, you are not just eating a piece of grilled eel. You are consuming the final visible point of a chain that runs from armed poachers in French rivers, through corrupt logistics networks, through international cargo systems, through farms built specifically to launder illegal fish into legal inventory, and through kitchens where some chefs have decided that the paperwork is good enough and the flavor is too important to question. The sushi restaurant industry globally is on track to nearly double in value by 2027. The demand is accelerating. The European eel population is still falling. If the culinary world does not actively break this chain, lab-grown alternatives from companies like Forseya Foods represent the only realistic path toward a future where unagi can still be served without funding a criminal empire and accelerating the extinction of a wild species. But that future requires the Michelin-star world to accept something it has historically resisted: that the most expensive plate in the room is not automatically the most honest one. The only reason this entire criminal architecture exists at all, the oxygen bags, the airport smugglers, the DNA laundering farms, the forged CITES paperwork, is because of a single biological fact buried deep in the Atlantic Ocean. The European eel's insistence on being born in the Sargasso Sea, in waters so deep and so far offshore that science has never successfully witnessed it happening, makes the species impossible to reproduce in captivity. That single, unresolved mystery of natural history is the foundation on which a $3 billion black market was built. The fish that cannot be bred is the fish that can never be made legal. And the fish that can never be made legal is the fish that will always be worth stealing. The rabbit hole goes much deeper than your plate, and now you know exactly where it begins.